Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I understand you guys have a big game on Saturday. Who's going to win? All right. All right. I'm glad to see there's no debate on that. It's an honor to be with you here today at the Citadel. I want to thank General Rosa for inviting me and for having me at the Citadel. I also want to acknowledge Lieutenant General Mike Steele, Chairman of the Board. And I want to thank Cadet Colonel Colin Hicks, Regimental Commander for the Corps. I'm assuming that was applause of some sort. On a more serious note, some of you may one day be called to defend your country. If you choose to serve, you will do it willingly as a volunteer. Our military is second to none, and our excellence stems from having professionals who serve voluntarily. Since 1843, cadets like yourself have been coming from the Citadel and answering your nation's calling. The last year's class, 40% of you chose to serve and accepted commissions in the armed forces. You will serve if you do bravely and with purpose. You follow in the footsteps of graduates like Colonel Myron Harrington in the U.S. Marine Corps from Citadel class of 1960, who during the Tet Offensive in 1968 led a courageous assault against a heavily fortified enemy stronghold in Way City. Disregarding extreme personal danger, he led his Marines in overrunning the enemy position. For that action, Colonel Harrington received the Navy Cross, the second highest military award for valor in combat. Colonel Harrington is with us today, and I'd like to thank him for his service. In fact, all of us, I think, should thank him for his service and bravery. Some people in Washington think war is a chess game. I think if you ask Colonel Harrington, he'd tell you differently. Those of us in Washington must make decisions. You will fight the wars, but we have to make decisions about whether we go to war. And we owe you something. We owe you something that I think is sometimes lacking in Washington. We owe you a full and proper consideration of the pros and cons of war. We owe it to you to follow our Constitution, and for Congress to debate and authorize all wars. We owe it to you to clearly show our national interest before we go into war. We owe it to you to have a sound strategy, an achievable goal, and most of all, an exit plan, so we don't get stuck in quagmires for decades on end. And above all, we should demand a formal declaration of war before we ask you to risk and ask our soldiers to risk their blood and their lives. I've taken an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies. I consider it the primary and foremost duty of the federal government to defend America, to defend our Bill of Rights, and to defend our God-given liberties. As a senator, I will, if I have to, not hesitate to vote for war, if war is needed to defend the United States. Once war is declared, it is the duty of the Commander-in-Chief to fight faithfully and to execute victory. America can't shrink from its role in the world. We have been and should continue to be a shining example of good, and at times a superpower of last resort to maintain peace and prosperity. America must be engaged with the world, commercially, diplomatically, and when necessary, militarily. But to be engaged doesn't mean to always be engaged in war. Reagan believed in peace through strength. His defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, presented a doctrine that insisted that war occur only as a last resort, only when a vital national interest was at stake, and only when our objective was complete victory. For inspiration and guidance, I often look to America's greatest military leaders. Some of our best observations on war and diplomacy come from the president, who is one of our most decorated generals, Dwight Eisenhower. In David Nichols' book, Eisenhower, 1956, he writes that I believed with good reason that once the violence begins, everything changes and you can throw your plans in the trash. It's too bad more in Washington don't heed Ike's advice today. In Egypt recently, we saw a military coup that this administration says was not a coup. In a highly unstable situation, our government continues to send, or continued to send for quite a while, F-16s and Abrams tanks and American-made tear gas to Egypt when it was against the law. My guess is that those protesting for freedom in Egypt, who were on the receiving end of tear gas made in Pennsylvania, don't harbor warm, fuzzy feelings about us. Before aiding the generals, though, we sent F-16s and tanks and billions of dollars in aid to a government they just overthrew, to President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. Before Morsi, we sent billions in planes and tanks to Hosni Mubarak, a dictator who we called our ally. Common sense tells us that we shouldn't be sending dictators or the Muslim Brotherhood our money, our treasure. Common sense tells us that we shouldn't be delivering advanced weaponry into unstable situations where the outcome is completely unpredictable. And I will tell you one thing of which I'm certain. We shouldn't be sending foreign aid to nations that burn our flag. Without question, it is a mistake. In 2012, I introduced a bill in the Senate that calls for halting the transport of weapons to Egypt, to Pakistan, and to Libya. In February of this year, I introduced an amendment that would have prevented the shipment of these weapons to the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the American people are with me. I think they realize we have limited resources and shouldn't be sending weapons to people who hate us. But the Senate defeated this legislation. This past summer, I introduced another bill to prevent the sale of weapons to Egypt after the military coup. It's what the law says. We shouldn't even require another bill. U.S. law states that all foreign aid must be suspended when there's a military coup. But what did this administration do? It simply pretends there's not a coup, continues to send weapons and arms to Egypt. In Egypt, the regimes keep changing, but our system of foreign aid stays the same. After several months of ignoring the law, finally, the president did. The Obama administration finally agreed to stop the military aid. I say too little, too late. We are either a nation of laws or we're not. Unlike Eisenhower and earlier generations, we too often don't think before we act. I think many in Washington do things in our foreign policy to accomplish short-term goals, but ultimately hurt our national interests and our allies. As we continue to aid and arm despotic regimes in Egypt, we're also now sending weapons to rebels in Syria. According to a recent Pew poll, 70% of Americans are against arming the Islamic rebels in Syria, yet the Senate continues to do this. The administration continues to arm these Islamic rebels. This is unacceptable. The Assad regime is no friend of ours, no friend of freedom, but it doesn't mean that the enemy of our enemy is always our friend. There are currently many rebel groups in Syria, including extremist forces such as al-Nusra, Hezbollah, and al-Qaeda. Those in Washington who are eager to send these weapons say, oh, they're not going to fall into the hands of the enemy. Do you believe that? Does anyone believe that? We have trouble telling friend from foe in Afghanistan. We've had 100 of your fellow soldiers die from friendly fire from people we can't figure out whether they're friend or foe in Afghanistan. You think we're going to be able to figure out the difference in Syria? It's 1,000-fold more chaotic in Syria. Even our Joint Chief of Staff's General Martin Dempsey warns it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell friend from foe in Syria. Would Eisenhower, who believed that small wars could lead to big wars, buy into this nonsense? Regardless, the United States government should not, even if indirectly, be arming al-Qaeda. This administration is currently moving ahead with plans to do precisely that without any authorization. I won't get a vote. The president just says he's going to arm the Syrian rebels. How can we ask our brave young men to fight around the world against al-Qaeda while in some countries actually arming al-Qaeda? It makes no sense. I, for one, am not inclined to make America the Air Force for al-Qaeda. There's also the very real possibility that these weapons may be used against 2 million Christians. There are 2 million Christians that live in Syria. They're protected by Assad. We have no legitimate national interest in Syria. It is certainly not in our interest to arm extremists who might one day use those weapons against Americans or to kill Christians within their country. Why do we arm dictators and the Muslim Brotherhood? Why do we arm affiliates of al-Qaeda or allies of al-Qaeda and endanger Christians? Why do we reward Pakistan with our tax dollars as they continue to imprison the man who helped us to catch bin Laden? He was given 33 years in prison. I said no more aid to Pakistan unless they release him. This administration just keeps sending good money after bad. The first and primary function of our government is a strong national defense, bar none. But so much of what we do in Washington today is more like an irrational offense. How does sending foreign aid to Egypt, to Syria, to Pakistan help our national security? Does it make us stronger? Does it make it less likely or more likely that we get drawn into some war in the Middle East? In Egypt, in Pakistan, they riot and burn our flag. You know, really, how can we? I say no more. Not one penny more to these countries that are burning our flag or allow mobs. In Egypt, the mob was on top of our embassy and almost got in our embassy. Where was the Egyptian military to defend our embassy? It's inexcusable. In Libya, we used to oppose the dictator Muammar Gaddafi. The guy was responsible for the Lockerbie bombing, killed American school kids. Then someone had the genius idea, let's make him an ally. There were members of the Senate who flew over and said, let's give Gaddafi weapons. Interestingly, those same members, not long later, were now supporting giving money to the rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. Which is it? Do they like Gaddafi or do they like the rebels? Why are we arming both sides? So a year later, we have the tragedy in Libya, where our ambassador and other diplomats are murdered in the streets of Benghazi. Was this done by some of the rebels that we actually assisted in overthrowing Gaddafi? Why did we ever get involved with this? Why did we ever help Gaddafi? And most importantly, when Hillary Clinton was asked for more security, she turned the ambassador down. Under cross-examination, I asked her, did you read the cables? She said she never read any of the cables. That's her excuse. She says, don't blame me. Somebody beneath me should have been reading those cables. I find it a dereliction of duty, a clear dereliction of duty. She wants to blame it on somebody else. It's absolutely a responsibility, and her failure to provide our ambassador and his mission with adequate security should preclude Hillary Clinton from ever holding high office again. Amidst the chaos in the Middle East, we've always had one friend, a friend that never leaves our side, Israel. As an ally, Israel's never wavered. And one thing you can know for sure, and I've visited there, you will never see an Israeli burning an American flag. America's never backed down from a fight, but we should never be a nation that's eager to get involved in a fight. The veterans I've talked to who have fought in war aren't eager for war. In fact, when you have more veterans in Congress, you're actually less likely to have war. President Eisenhower said, I have one yardstick by which I test every major problem, and that is it good for America? Is our current foreign policy good for America? Is our engagement or involvement in Egypt, in Syria, and Pakistan to our benefit or to our detriment? I think we must have the strongest military on earth, not because we're eager to use it, but because no one would ever dare to challenge us. I think Reagan got it right when he said, as for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is our highest aspiration. We will negotiate for it, we will sacrifice for it, but we will not surrender for it, now or ever. Our forbearance should not be misunderstood. Our reluctance for conflict should not be misjudged as a failure of will. When action is required to preserve our national security, we will act. We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength. There's probably no clearer disposition of what it means to have peace through strength. For our country's sake, certainly for our soldiers' sake, for the sake of every veteran who ever donned the uniform and fought for his country or her country, America's mission should always be to keep the peace, not police the world. In America that did not seek to become involved in every conflict around the world would do things that could make us safer at home and abroad. We could modernize and strengthen our military. In a few weeks, I'll be announcing a task force to do just that, to bring together great minds from our national defense and put forward a plan to modernize our military so we have the most modern, highly technological, highly capable military and strengthen our defenses. We will begin by an audit of the Pentagon. Not because I dislike the military, because I like the military. I want to cut out waste and fraud and make the military stronger and direct the resources where they need to go. But it means you have to have the strength to look even at military spending and say, nobody gets a blank check. With the savings from modernization and a more reasonable foreign policy, we'll do something that we're failing at right now. We'll make and take better care of our nation's greatest resource, our service members. We'll train them better, equip them better, and we'll fix a broken VA system. As a physician, when I visited Walter Reed, I was profoundly impacted by the young men and women there. Close in age to my own kids, receiving care for injuries sustained in battle, it reinforces my worldview about the need to prevent conflict unless it's absolutely necessary. Those injured in our most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan will require a lifetime of care. We must work together to provide for that, to protect those who have protected us. We must be more prudent, though, in our foreign policy. Eisenhower was right to observe that little wars can lead to big wars. Reagan was right that America's purpose is to promote peace through strength. Reagan once said, above all, we must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of our free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. We do ourselves no favors when we aid our enemies, when we aid the enemies of freedom around the world. America's always stood tall as a shining beacon of hope and freedom to the world. America's guiding light is made possible. Those willing to wield the sword and the shield. Unwavering, steadfast, the American soldier, a volunteer in defense of liberty. For you, we are grateful for your service and for your sacrifice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
People would ask questions, come down here. Thank you, Senator Paul, for those inspiring remarks. We have time for 3 questions from the Corps Cadets. Instead of the normal practice of bringing the microphone to you, we ask that you come down to the microphone located on the floor.
Good morning, Senator. I'm Cadet Logan Morris and Vice President of our Society of Libertarians. And I would just like to ask you, what is the #1 issue facing America in the coming years, and how can the Republican Party combat this issue?
It's a debt. And people say, oh, your generation is going to inherit the debt and it's going to be a problem. It is, but it's already a problem. Economists say that the burden of our debt right now is costing 1 million jobs a year. So while some of you will serve in the military and have a position, 60% of you are going to be looking for jobs. There aren't enough jobs because of this burden of debt. There are also not enough jobs because we're an overtaxed and overregulated nation. So the biggest problem is the debt, leads to loss of jobs. The way we correct it is we need a smaller federal government and a larger private economy.
Thank you, Senator.
Morning, sir. Cadet John Fogel. You talked a lot about Dwight Eisenhower, and our first president, George Washington, was also a military commander. But in the Constitution, we believe that the military should be headed by a civilian. And how do you feel about the importance of military service in presidents past and future?
All right. Well, one of the things I mentioned is that the more people we have who have actually either been in combat or in the military service in the government, I think it's interesting that during those periods of time when people look at it, we actually were less likely to be involved in war. I think if you talk to some of our bravest soldiers, I would say that they would probably say they're not eager for war. We need to have a certain reluctance for war. So I think people who have actually been involved in combat are more circumspect than people who have never fought. Is it a prerequisite for serving or being a president? No, I don't think it is. But I think it's useful to have many people involved. And I think the idea of having civilians is a very important distinction. Even when we elected a general like Eisenhower, we elected him as a civilian. And so it makes us much different than other countries. You see other countries led by generals, they're usually autocracies. You know, they're totalitarian regimes. And so I'm very worried about having an active duty military person. I think our tradition is very good that we separate civilian from the military.
Thank you, sir.
This will be our last question.
Senator Paul, on the subject of holding the current administration accountable, do you think we should pursue incidents such as Benghazi? And if yes, what do you think the final outcome should be?
Yes. It's my opinion, and this is an opinion that needs to be supported by interviewing those involved. It is my opinion that I cannot believe that a military commander did not send reinforcements. I fully believe that in Benghazi a politician was involved. We won't name any names, but I think someone was involved with that decision. There was a lot of discussion going on that night. There is some debate whether or not they could have gotten from Italy, but there were still soldiers in Tripoli. In my understanding, and I know a lot of you are from military families, if you've ever known someone involved, Marines, Army, or otherwise, they go after and rescue their dead, their wounded. There were still people alive and fighting for hours upon hours, and there were some people in Tripoli who could have gone. I don't think that decision was made by a military person. I think it was made ultimately by a politician. And I think we need to know that. And so I think everybody needs to be interviewed. They need to come in, and the question needs to be asked, who was it that made the decision not to send soldiers from Tripoli to reinforce those under attack in Benghazi? To my mind, we should never have a commander-in-chief who is unwilling to send in troops for reinforcement, or in the 6-month period of time did not send adequate security when it was asked for repeatedly. To me, that should preclude you from ever holding the high office.
Thank you, Senator.
Again, thank you, Senator Paul, for coming to the Citadel for this Greater Issues address. As a token of our appreciation, I present you with something that has a great deal of symbolism for this institution. This is a picture of Paget Thomas Barracks, the building that is one of our most identifiable icons. That concludes our program. Please join me in one more round of applause for Senator Paul.